First Secretary of the High Commission of the Republic of Singapore, Mr. Iqbal Hafiz, CEO of the Malaysian Institute for Debate and Public Speaking, and last but not least, Mr. Faisal Moidin, Managing Partner of Moidin & Max. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we present your debaters. In opening government, the University of the Philippines. The University of the Philippines is represented by Lee Arcia and Elmer Cruz. In opening opposition, we have Universitas Indonesia. Universitas Indonesia is represented by Roderick Sibarani and Terry Mutahari. In closing government, the National University of Singapore. The National University of Singapore is represented by Imran Rahim and Robin Teo. In closing opposition, we have the International Islamic University, Malaysia, represented by Arina Najwa and Said Sadiq. Before we begin, the format for today's debate is British parliamentary. A British parliamentary debate comprises 8 speakers, 4 speaking in favor of a motion and 4 against, and each side is made up of two teams of 2 individuals. Speeches are 7 minutes in length, with the first and last minute protected, and points of information cannot be offered in protected time. The bell will ring after the first minute, at the 6th minute, and at the end of their speech. Ladies and gentlemen, on the motion, this House believes that the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights is an ineffective safeguard of human rights. We now call this House to order. We welcome the Honourable Prime Minister, who will begin the case that stands in his name.
The malingering struggle that humankind faces to universalize human rights underpins the immense barrier between the point of theory and the point of practice. We battle against power and privilege of the benevolent strongmen. We seek resolution between parties with long-standing conflict. In these pursuits, the role of international documents to impel the permeation of such values is paramount. We've had the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, a European Convention in 1950, American and African counterparts in 1969 and 1973 respectively. Last November, an ASEAN Declaration was signed. Today we debate its capacity to wield the banner of human rights in a region that has shown resistance under the guise of so-called Asian values. The goal of today's debate is to talk about the bridging between theory and practice under 2 particular manifestations. Firstly, is a well-defined theory consistent with the high standards of human rights, and secondly, the diffusion of such values throughout society that translates to the empowerment of these rights seek to begin with. To be very clear, we are not against any form of declaration. We're just against the elements contained with the current declaration in its current form. 2 arguments at Prime Minister, which focus primarily on the language and definitions contained within the declaration. First, the failure of inclusivity, and second, the betrayal of protection, both of which speak to the impending failure of the declaration. Let's move on to the first. The universal human rights envisions the empowerment of individuals to define their lives in ways that are most meaningful to them. For example, through the relationships we keep with the people around us, or through our faith and creed. We should understand that these definitions would vary from individual to individual. Therefore, there must be inclusion amidst diversity. A powerful idea ought to be protected. We think that in almost all the established instruments for human rights, the right to freedom of association and the protection of gender are clearly defended. But what we see in the current form of the ASEAN Declaration is the absence of such, ladies and gentlemen. What is more, we think there is also the appearance of other forms, ladies and gentlemen, such as the being forced to disappearance, ladies and gentlemen. We think that in its current form, it is absolutely weak. We think that these three things are really important and strongly protected under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what we must remember is that these 10 member states are already signatories to the United Nations. And therefore, if you compare our commitments to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the commitments that we seek through this declaration, ladies and gentlemen, there is a great disparity that is unacceptable. And we think that we should evaluate it as a backslide. OP can say in today's debate that there's the convenient excuse that these may be lumped under the category of other rights, ladies and gentlemen. We think, however, that this bold move of exclusion not only highlights the popularity of Asian values, it affirms them, ladies and gentlemen, and that's going to be damaging down the line. No, thank you. The second argument speaks to the unveil a more insidious danger. Within the document, there is relativism in granting human rights on the basis of vague duties of citizens. In Article 7, it states that the realization of human rights must be considered in the regional and national context. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that this can be easily misconstrued for states to exempt themselves from protecting human rights to begin with. We think, however, that surely derogations exist even in the EU Convention of Human Rights and Freedoms in order to temporarily adapt to to armed conflicts, for example, or violent unrest, or the idea of natural disasters. But within these conventions, we can see that there are carefully defined terms with which these temporary nature of how we can suspend rights are given, ladies and gentlemen, such as the severity or the temporary nature, ladies and gentlemen, or even the proportionality with which we can suspend rights. We can even say that there are sacrosanct rights clearly defined in other conventions. This is not the case in the ASEAN Declaration, where instead we have a sweeping statement that is ill-defined in terms of the exemptions that we can apply. It would be so easy to say, ladies and gentlemen, that torture is something that is allowable against rebels, or it's so easy to say that we can persecute religious minorities such as the Rohingyans, for example, ladies and gentlemen. These damaging interpretations are a betrayal to the inalienability of what human rights ought to stand for, ladies and gentlemen. Before I go on, are there any points of information?
If you are for absolute universalism against regionalism, then are you against the formation of the African Union Charter on humans and people's rights as well?
Again, we already clarified from the beginning that we aren't against any form of declaration. What we are against, ladies and gentlemen, is the susceptibility in which we can interpret these documents and the liabilities that can ensue, ladies and gentlemen, with which we can see that the human rights are not going to be protected under the current model, under the current wording of the ASEAN Declaration. So that's the harm, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the propensity for these interpretations to sprout out is especially seen in countries that have been historically obstructionist to the formation of human rights to begin with. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, these two arguments show us that instead of working against Asian values, rather, the declaration allows them to fester and spread like a cancer, ladies and gentlemen, under the veil of the declaration. We think that this is unacceptable. If OP would say, ladies and gentlemen, that this is all we can do right now, we think that that's a false statement to make. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that it's incredibly defeatist and it's an incredibly damaging narrative to take. It's unacceptable in the context of the pursuit of human rights, which is paramount, ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate. Ultimately, a strong, unambiguous, and effective protection of human rights requires a concomitant, strong, and unambiguous document that protects those rights to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. That is not the case with the ASEAN Declaration. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the propensity for rights to be withheld, the rights that are not going to be protected, ladies and gentlemen, is greater under the veil of such a hollow declaration. For all these reasons, the motion stands.
We would like to thank the Honourable Prime Minister for his speech. And now, to begin the case for the opposition benches, we welcome the Honourable Leader of Opposition.
after the ratifications of ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights, Philippines Foreign Secretary Albert Del Rosario said that it's a form and it's a legacy for our children. That's where opening opposition stand in this debate. We think that ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights is the most compact and realistic declarations of human rights that we can have as a regional community. Moreover than that, we think ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights is the biggest investments that we have as a region, is the first sign that ASEAN community are progressing to the point where we already recognize human rights, to the point where our people will get and can exercise all their fundamental rights in current times and in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, we think the decisions of our member states to have ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights indicates that our member states are already have the aspirations and commitments in relation to perform protection for our people in ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. Before I'm going to prove to you why the ASEAN Declarations is the most effective and realistic framework that we currently have right now, and it will give a bigger diplomatic tools for us to create a bigger realistic protections for human rights of our people. Let me deal and give some rebuttals to the opening government. Opening government tried to explain on how that ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights are not including the freedoms of associations, and also does not explain the forced disappearance that can be conducted by the government. We beg to differ as the opening opposition. In the Article number 2 and the General Principles of ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights, it's already clearly stated that fundamental rights of the people should be upheld by the government, despite their religion, despite their race, despite their cultural backgrounds. And we think that these clauses, we think that this clauses already implies to you that human rights are very absolute inside ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover than that, if their concern are saying that these clauses are not specific enough, we think that in the future we could have amendments of our ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights to create a more specific explanations, so there will be no ambiguity in the process of interpretations of this clause in the end of the day. No thanks. Last rebuttals. We think that the interpretations of national security of other clause which can lead to the abuse of human rights for minority, for example, will never exist if we have ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights, ladies and gentlemen. And we think it's better to have an explanations of national security and also public morality inside our ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights, because it's performed and it can cater all the inspiration come from all member states in ASEAN countries, ladies and gentlemen. It can perform that all countries have the willingness to protect human rights in the end of the day. But moreover than that, we think that it's important to have the explanation and to have our standardizations of what is human rights as the ASEAN community, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think it's different with the Western concept which being established and drafted by Western people. And we think it's not justified to use, to not have ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights. My first argument will talk about on how that would be very effective and perform. Would be very effective and perform to create a commitment to the government to protect human rights, ladies and gentlemen. We think that when we have a clause such as national security, such as national contacts inside our ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights, we think that we will have more bigger incentive for our government to join to the ASEAN Declarations of Human Rights, ladies and gentlemen, because they feel their aspiration are being channeled by the declarations itself. There will be a sense of possession and contributions come from any member states, ladies and gentlemen, even states like Myanmar. We think that it's very important to, we think that it's very important to have these kinds of definition and to have the freedom to define certain human rights protection according to your national context and to your national security, ladies and gentlemen. And it will create a bigger commitment for these people, for these states, for all states in the ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. The commitment will be bigger because we think that there will be an internalization of values of human rights in the level of the politicians, ladies and gentlemen. We think that there will be startings of discussion of political values inside the parliament, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that it's very important, right, to have a debate on what is human rights in the level of the parliaments, because it's the place where we create policy for our citizens, ladies and gentlemen. And when we start a debate about human rights standards, for example, and there will be an outcome of policy which also will talk and direct the protections of human rights in the future. Before I go, closing.
So do you honestly believe that the Rohingyas fleeing Rakhine state actually believe that this declaration is effective?
We say that the only way for us to solve the problems of Rohingya, for example, oppression of the minority, it's come from the internal states itself, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the answer are not coming from the third party, but the answer and the willingness should come from the states, which come from their own politicians in the parliament level to have a policy to start caring for people in the oppressed minority, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover than that, we also say that current condition in ASEAN already progressing, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the current situation is already progressing, ladies and gentlemen. We think that we should follow the dynamics of democracy that currently we have in ASEAN region. For example, ladies and gentlemen, this dynamic of democracy are first happen at the level of the government, ladies and gentlemen, where most of the states in ASEAN already create an independent commissions of human rights to start to have independent commission to scrutinize any human rights abuse that happen inside the country. But moreover than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the willingness of the society to follow democratic order, it's also progressing right now. For example, in Myanmar, which people already start to say and to affirm and to cast their aspirations towards the government, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that it's a good sign, right? We cannot judge that ASEAN right now is a stagnant regional community. What we can look is that ASEAN regional right now are having a progress within its government, within its states, and within its government, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover than that, in the concept of democracy, we think it's very important to have limitations, to have and to give the country and the states to determine what rights should be just regulated inside our state, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, the opening opposition believe that it's good for us to have ASEAN declarations of human rights because it's the biggest investments that we could have as a region currently and right now. We beg you to oppose.
We thank the Honourable Opposition Leader for his speech. And now, to further the case for University of the Philippines and for opening government, we welcome the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, ladies and gentlemen, from a nation with a dark history of human rights abuses, I am profoundly honored and deeply humbled to be given the privilege to speak with regards to the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration. As Deputy Prime Minister, I will analyze and deconstruct the ineffectiveness of the declaration on the level of people and governments. Number one, why the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is devoid of public consultations and people empowerment, which is a fundamental element of any effective political tool. But number two, I'm going to analyze why the document paves the way for the supremacy of state sovereignty over the fundamental human rights of individuals. But before that, let me engage the leader of the opposition. His first case is that we should celebrate this first legacy because the ASEAN finally recognizes human rights. This is fundamentally flawed because in the past, ASEAN countries are already signatories to the International Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That means there is no added value with an affirmation of this current declaration. But second of all, it's more dangerous that the legacy that they are espousing is a legacy that is not inclusive and is even a step backward from the previous recognition of human rights that were more inclusive. In fact, if you look at the declaration right now, the resounding difference that we can see is the convenient removal of certain political rights that were espoused within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, such as the right to free association, for example, or the right against forced disappearances. No, thank you. But third of all, he says, this is just the first step. After all, we can create changes in the future. One, there is a fundamental logical mistake in this way of thinking because it argues for the future form of the declaration and is not defending why the current form is already effective in the first place, which is the burden of the whole opposition bench. The fact that they agree that changes and amendments must be made is a soft concession that, in fact, the current form is imperfect and is subject to abuse by certain governments. Next, he says, you know what, let's allow the government a space to explain their decisions after all. This opportunity for the governments to explain their misinterpretations of the law or the declaration is the fact why opening government is so much against it. Are they okay with the fact that governments can torture suspects in the guise of national sovereignty, or that journalists will be forced to disappear because they are labeled as threats to the state, or even Rohingyas systematically being abused under the cloak of public morality? These are the forms of government explanation that are unacceptable to opening government. We think that human rights are inalienable and inherent and shouldn't be subject to the interpretations of a government. Lastly, he says it can be subject to checks. It can be checked by a body. Number one, the declaration in itself does not have an implementing body or a commission or a court that is effective in terms of implementing it towards member states. That's why I think he was logically wrong in arguing how systematically we can check certain states because of the existence of the declaration. Yes, sir.
When the Filipino Constitution was first created, weren't ambiguous words used as well?
Well, specifically, the Constitution of the Philippines did not create for a space for government to interpret it so much so that they can use it as a guise for violating rights, such as maybe using torture as a guise to protecting national sovereignty. That's the important thing. Let me extend the analysis of opening government. Number one, I'm going to analyze why people's participation is important for the effectiveness of a particular political tool. Let's look at the method of how the declaration was constructed. We say that the process of forming the document is non-consultative to the public. In fact, if you look at the current popular grounds from the grassroots, from government organization, their main contention is that the process of forming it was isolated towards government agents. There was a closed-door consultation. There was an active removal of public participation, like there was a discrete formation of the declaration. What is critical in this case is that you are creating a one-sided conservative declaration that is only from the perspective of the agents of the state, which have their own political agendas, such as, say, territorial rights, or their desire to preserve their power, or maybe to form their own resources. The implication of this one-sided isolationist policy is that it restricted other rights that are critical to people on the ground, such as the right to free association, the right against forced disappearances.
Lee?
We say, no thank you, that forming popular groups are integral towards the rights theory, that rights are the people's defense against the abusive power of the state, and that it must be the people who will create and integrate their conception of rights. Why is this so critical? It violates the declaration. It violates the creation of popular ownership of the document and does not create grassroots support. In fact, if you look at the current mode or the current status of the declaration, it is against and isolationist to the people. That means people are not supporting the document and people are not rallying behind it. We think that it becomes an ineffective declaration because people are not owning it, people were not consulted in the creation of it, and people are currently against it. The second level of analysis is with regards affirming the state supremacy. If we look at human rights violations, we see that the state is the most common perpetrator of human rights violation. That's precisely the reason why whenever we create declaration, it must restrict states to allow them for them to pursue spaces for interpreting it, such as for state sovereignty. What is the precedence for this? If you look at the EU Commissioner on Human Rights, they were interpreting the government as the ultimate arbiter of morality and power to rule over the land. Why is this so important? The declaration allows for the ability for the government to be the ultimate arbiter of what is right for the individual and what is wrong for the individual. We think that from opening government, we must establish a high threshold of human rights. We're not just talking about certain privileges or desires of societies, but we are talking about the fundamental reasons of why we exist as a society, like protecting our own dignity, protecting our social mobility, and things like that. We say that the threat created by the declaration is that it affirms the ASEAN values. It affirms the soft stance of non-interventionism. It affirms the power of the state over the people and the power of state sovereignty over fundamental human rights. And we think that's largely indefensible. But third of all, we think that the declaration is ineffective because it was created as a tokenistic form in a status quo wherein the communities and the states are not ready to create such a unified declaration. We think that the implication is that we created a substandard document, and it's better for us to go in the past wherein we were siding with an effective international standard. What did you get from opening government? One, we analyzed why the form and the content is structurally ineffective. Number two, how it's a step backward because now it restricts rights. And number three, how it's ineffective on the level of the people and the level of the government. Opposition side have to defend why the current form of the declaration is in itself effective in protecting our rights. With that, we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank the Honorable Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. We now call upon the Honorable Deputy Leader of the Opposition to extend the debate today.
Ladies and gentlemen, in opening opposition, we believe that ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is far from perfect. But that does not mean that the fact that ASEAN countries finally start talking about right to live, freedom to be free from torture, and all other fundamental rights as their own and as the result of their discussion, we don't believe that it does not signify the commitment from ASEAN countries made to countries that they care the most, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that this means that ASEAN Human Rights Declaration signifies a commitment that would be effective in safeguarding against human rights abuse in the future. And that's why this motion should fall. So I want to talk about two things in my rebuttals. First of all, whether the content of ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is actually in line with the best interests of human rights protection. And number two, whether ASEAN Human Rights Declaration actually helps the human rights protection. Let's talk about the first one, whether the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration is actually in line with the best interests of human rights protection. Because Terry has already told you that the imperfect clauses are subject to change in the future. But then they said that this means that we concede that this Human Rights Declaration is not perfect as it is. We agree that this isn't perfect as it is. But the fact that ASEAN countries finally talk about this right to live, right to freedom from torture, can be a basis for civil societies and also for opposition leaders to use this as a basis of the state's commitment, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore the state's commitment and the state's duty to protect. And therefore, the burden for the opposition leader in these types of countries that violate human rights is to only show whether or not what the states are doing are actually violating human rights when it hasn't been the concern of ASEAN countries in the past, when they never talk about it in such international forum, ladies and gentlemen. But they also said that this is not in line with the best interests of human rights because the declaration isn't involving other people, such as civil society. But he never explained why the only channel in which people and civil society can contribute is by drafting the documents, because civil society in Myanmar has been successful in rallying international pressure against this oppression of Rohingya people through the dissemination of of pictures in Facebook and other social networking accounts, even though they weren't included in the drafting process of, I don't know, the constitution perhaps, because we said that civil society and other non-governmental bodies are already involving in protecting human rights in so many other different ways. The part that hasn't been involved is the government, ladies and gentlemen, because it is the government that hasn't made the commitment. I'm going to talk later about why the commitment in United Nations isn't enough. It is the government that hasn't made the commitment that is truly from them. And we say that the fact that governments are the one that is talking about this human rights commitment signifies the effectiveness of this declaration. So let's talk about whether ASEAN Human Rights Declaration actually helps the human rights protection, because they said it isn't, because ASEAN countries are already ratifying United Nations Declaration of Human Rights anyway. But for your information, at the 1993 in UN Vienna Conference of Human Rights, Vietnam, Pakistan, Malaysia, Singapore, along with other states, tried to say that at Vienna that international human rights were essentially Western and therefore inappropriate for other societies. And not surprisingly, the fact that Western countries have been pressuring Myanmar and applying sanctions into them does not produce meaningful results and does not actually create change in Myanmar, ladies and gentlemen. It was actually pressure from ASEAN countries and the growing sense of interconnectedness between ASEAN countries that pressure Myanmar to change themselves into a better path, ladies and gentlemen. So the commitment they made in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was not really a commitment because it does not involve ASEAN countries in the drafting process. The very same characteristic they use on civil society. And they also never responded to a lot of terrorist material which stated that it is only ASEAN Human Rights Declaration that states the importance of national security and also public morality that can only give the incentive for politicians to actually want to engage in this human rights declaration, ladies and gentlemen, because there's the sense of national specificity. So let's talk about my point of substantive, because we think, no thank you, ASEAN Human Rights Declaration makes ASEAN countries more open and willing to engage with dynamics of human rights, because no human rights standards is perfect. Even in countries that are claimed to be a model of human rights, such as European countries, the extent of freedom of expression that's allowed changes from time to time. Changes within blasphemy law, libel law, and other limitations on freedom of expression that are flexible in responding to social changes, such as extremism or xenophobia. And bearing that in mind, we think it's important that ASEAN countries engage with these types of dynamic regarding human rights with an open mind. And if we take a look at the massive movement of goods and services that ASEAN economic community will bring about in the future, it will necessarily bring about a debate about labor rights and the rights of international labor, and flow of refugees between ASEAN countries and many other potentially dynamics that's very likely to happen in a region as big as ASEAN, ladies and gentlemen. In responding with those dynamics, it is important that countries and societies keep an open mind. No thank you. Observe all suggestions as objectively as possible, and it is also important for all parties to be willing to engage with this discussion. And ASEAN Human Rights Declaration helps the ASEAN countries in becoming as willing and as objective as possible, because this is a standard of human rights that they created, that they have a sense of ownership to. After ASEAN countries finally start talking about right to live, right to equal protection, all those rights that are fundamental to human rights are no longer just Western values, ladies and gentlemen. This has become internalized to ASEAN countries as an ASEAN value. So politicians that are used, that that are against human rights can no longer use the argument that we should reject this human right because this is essentially Western values, ladies and gentlemen. So it's easier for ASEAN countries to gather political support for more freedom of expression that when this becomes important and becomes a duty for them to protect in the future, because it is their creation and they need to respond to this as objectively as possible, and they do not need to wholeheartedly reject it, ladies and gentlemen. So opening opposition has recognized that ASEAN Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights is far from perfect, but this signifies the commitment between states that feel the meaningfulness between each other, and most likely they're going to want to keep it in the future because this is the neighbor and this is them, and they want to contribute to the success of this ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. We oppose.
We thank the Honourable Deputy Opposition Leader for his speech. To further the case for the government benches and for the National University of Singapore, we invite the Honourable Member of Government.
Young Arif, ladies and gentlemen, on 18th November 2012, as this declaration was adopted by the ASEAN member states in the city of Phnom Penh, within the vicinity of that meeting were jails filled with political dissidents, political opponents, and journalists. This irony was not only demonstrative of a wider failing that has come to be associated with this declaration. It also reveals that this declaration was not the messianic instrument that 600 million people in this region has been calling out for. It is nothing more than a fig leaf for political leaders and governments to continue governing the way they have for decades upon decades. And that's why we, in closing government, think it is ineffective. I'll be addressing two main points in substantive. The first point is how this declaration has effectively ossified a regime of supposed rights that deny meaningful protection to the people in ASEAN. And secondly, that it is ineffective because the declaration can never be effectively enforced, not only by virtue of its structural failings, but also because nothing, no evidence, suggests any form of norms that will otherwise show that it would be enforceable in the long run. In rebuttals vis-a-vis the opening opposition will be intertwined. On the first substantive point, ladies and gentlemen, on how this ossifies a regime of supposed rights that deny meaningful protection to people in ASEAN, we need to appreciate the ineluctable reality that this declaration was negotiated and determined effectively by the ruling elite of each ASEAN member state. In fact, with little input from civil society groups or organizations. This was one of the main complaints. And if we were to look at the language of the declaration itself, it also reveals as much. For example, in Article 6, the declaration has basically come up or invented this concept of a societal veto. Their rights ought to be made subject to the wider society's interests. Or that secondly, in Article 7, whereby rights are subject to national particularities, that it ought to be paired and fit within the national context itself. And why is this problematic? Is because it is a politically convenient instrument that was promulgated specifically to buttress the rule of each government of each ASEAN member state. And not only that, it demonstrates a powerlessness on the part of the people. Because now, if we were to look at the declaration, the rights are effectively the exceptions. That they are not the trumps. They've come to be associated with the concept of rights that we recognize in other declarations and other treaties of that nature. And this is terribly problematic because rights are the means by which the people basically negotiate with the governments in power to protect their fundamental interests. But unfortunately, because the declaration was conveniently created by the ruling elite, whereby the language of the declaration and its articles basically allows for the state to do whatever it wants and then avail itself of national particularities, what we see effectively be the continuation of the toleration of atrocities that has blighted this association for the longest time. Things like the Ampatuan massacre in the Philippines that have went largely ignored by every other country in ASEAN. Things like the Thai government clamping down on red shirts and basically nary a word was uttered by the other association members. Or the Tanjung Priok massacre that occurred in 1984 in northern Jakarta, where yet again, none of the member states basically picked up on. And we think that is a sorry state of affairs because meaningful protection is denied to these individuals. But more importantly and more perniciously, we think this denies the organic development of a culture that appreciates human rights. Because this creates a bargain that nationalism is antithetical to human rights. That to take in human rights, what we need to do is to circumscribe it, to fit it, to pare it down, to fit what we think ought to be the way. And why is this bad? Because then human rights will always be seen as an external hostile force. And this is problematic because if we were to look and survey history, that any durable compromise that has been reached is one that's been organically attained. One which we've amalgamated the concept of human rights with the forces that we see underlining these states and these countries. But as long as the people within this association states think that it's always a hostile state, that it's always antithetical to nationalism, then we think it'll be harder for human rights activists, for people like people in this room, to advocate for human rights because you will always be the outgroup. You will always be the people fighting against the wave, and we think in the long run that is problematic. No, thank you. And this deals with how we think that even in the short run or the long run, even though University of Indonesia might think that this is effective and promising, we beg to differ. On the second argument, on how it's ineffective because the declaration can hardly be enforced. Because a lot of the arguments coming from University Indonesia was the aspiration, the hope that things would improve, that things suggest likewise. But we don't think that's the case, for three simple reasons. The first reason, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission for Human Rights, which is the main watchdog which presumably will be enforcing this declaration, has only been given the mandate to develop strategies, not to investigate individual complaints or to basically enforce the declaration. And in the absence of any state strong enough to unilaterally force people to adhere to the declarations, we don't think anything meaningful will come out of it. Secondly, if we were to look at ASEAN, it has to be concluded on a basis of consensus. And if that's true, if the member state is the one that's violating the declaration, but yet we need their acquiescence to enforce it, we don't think meaningful enforcement will come about. But thirdly, the only way this can be enforced if member states understand that they have to pay a political price. If they're willing to give up a bit of their sovereignty to enable an overarching body to enforce the declaration. But history reveals that no evidence suggests that these states are willing to do so. In fact, what we're willing to do is be blind to the atrocities and allow them in the name of the exercise of their sovereignty to continue their violations. Ladies and gentlemen, politicians across ASEAN might give themselves a pat on the back for the promulgation of this declaration. The people in this room who advocate for human rights, to whom human rights matter, ought not to do that and recognize that this is ineffective. We propose.
We thank the Honourable Member of Government for his speech. We welcome the Honourable Member of Opposition to extend the case.
Testing.
The Rohingyas in Myanmar and the dissidents who were actively cracked down by the Cambodian government might not automatically be saved by this law at that point in time. But continuously demonizing the law will not make situation any better. Latching your hopes on security upon a perceived Western document like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will not make situation any better, because the reception of the law on the ground is far less receptive in contrast to a more palatable ASEAN-friendly law. As lawyers, as judges, future lawyers, we understand at times damaging concessions or concessions must be made for the greater good. And this is what we're looking at here. Under their policy, a complete rejection of a law which is largely seen as a law which permeates with Western interests, in contrast to a law which permeates with ASEAN interests. This House will provide to you 3 unique extensions. Firstly, how our policy will ferment positive, constructive discourse which will lead towards long-term changes and reforms within ASEAN. The second, to directly engage with the second extension from NUS, how the existence of this law will compel ASEAN member nations to act as a collective body in enforcing future human rights violations. And finally, how the existence of this legal linchpin will be used as a precursor to develop a stable ASEAN human rights courts in just the same way Africa and EU have done. Before that, a couple of rebuttals. Sit down. The first, are ambiguous wordings automatically evil? Because that was a concern from that side. Ambiguous wordings exist. 2 responses. Firstly, ambiguous wordings are common. During the first establishment of the European Convention, Article 1 was very vague when it comes to an enshrinement of your right to life, because at that point in time you can still commit abortion, at that point in time a death penalty can also be executed. But it was changed later. Article 2, which fundamentally declared the jurisdiction of the European courts, was only declared 5 years later, in 1955. What's the point which I'm trying to make? Ambiguities can be solved by case law, especially by judges who will continuously discuss this in all hierarchy of courts. It's normal. That's why my PUI was particularly pertinent. Because in this case, most national constitutions, when it was first created, reeks with ambiguities. But often judges will discuss about this and will clarify this. Sit down. Their next concern was that, but sometimes these judges might be corrupted, right? Like the Myanmar court. But there's a check to that. If you really want to quote Article 7, being it like that it's at times very ambiguous, it is disingenuous for President Tan Shui to say, systematic rape is cultural in my country. Torture is cultural in my country. At times, we draw an objective line, and we know what's culture. We know what's within your national interest, and obviously those standards do not fulfill it. So exploitations will not exist because continuous pressure from ASEAN nations and international observers will exist. So that point doesn't stand. Sit down. The second one, they said, opposition bench has made a soft concession because we agree that the law might be imperfect now, but in the long run it will change and will be better. That's not a concession, because it symbolizes the effectiveness of this law as it's being used as a platform for future perfections. Under your policy, this law will not exist and cannot even be used as that platform at all. And cut some slack, guys. This law has only been passed for not even more than 5 months. All the oppression which were painted by that side, right, like the Takbai massacre in Thailand, all happened prior to the introduction of the law. In just the same way how it took years for the African Charter on Humans and People's Rights to be fully enforced, only 5 years later, we think that situation will likely happen here as well. Sit down. The final rebuttal which I want to make is on this. They said the creation of the law was done in isolation and only elites were introduced. That's just a mere lie. I can't accept that. Why is it so? It took 2 years for the formation of the law to be created. The first introduction was in 2009, and 4 conferences were held. Initially, the government of Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines boycotted the formation of the law because it didn't fulfill basic human rights standards, because people in Philippines were lobbying against the formation of the law. The reason why they were able to reach a middle ground, because the people finally agreed that this is the best system which we are able to strike a balance upon. Therefore, pressure groups were listened upon. Sit down. My extension, how does this ferment positive discourse?
The first level, we think this will impact legal arbitration, because with the existence of this law, lawyers and judges in domestic courts will continuously quote this law and will use the law. The reason why this is important, because this will lead to its judicial precedence, which means that the public will be informed of the law, and this will lead to its long-term reforms. In 1994, the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia defined rape as an act of genocide. Their jurisprudential move echoed to its domestic courts all over the world because of the international precedent. The second part is that our policy will impact political discourse among ASEAN nations, because with the existence of this law, ASEAN members will be compelled to meet 2 times a year, high-profile meetings where they will only discuss human rights violations and none others. This is not like normal economic discussion. It's primarily about human rights, and that will lead to its change. Before I move on, opening.
In the current context, where the interpretation of these ambiguous terms are resolved already, such as the definition of rape, such as the right to torture, why revert back to such an ambiguous context?
Beautiful. If you check the ASEAN Declaration, the last I checked, if you look at Article 17, torture was clearly outlawed. And as I told you, ambiguities can be solved by judges in the long run, and that's what we stand for. The second extension to deal with NUS's case. How do we enforce this law? There are a few reasons why ASEAN members will enforce this law. The first reason is because if they don't enforce it, ASEAN members will be seen as complicit of the oppression, because oppression is happening under the formation of the law which they created. The law which they created are currently being infringed upon, therefore they have incentive to enforce it. But more importantly, inaction means they will waste all the time and effort which ASEAN members have put in forming the law. If you look at Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia, who initially boycotted the law, but who joined the bandwagon later, clearly shows that they have an incentive to enforce the law. But more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, we think this policy will lead to the formation of a court system. We saw this in European Union itself. In 1950s, initially, the law existed. But 5 years later, that law was being used as a legal linchpin to create the formation of a European court. We think that situation can happen here as well. Where have we reached so far? We need to recognize one thing. We need to strike a balance. Under their policy, individual nations, dictators, and genuinely good governments will most oftenly reject the law which exists under status quo. At least under our policy, this law will be more palatable to them, and they'll be obligated to follow the law because all 11 ASEAN members and the 10 collective ASEAN members have signed it and agreed to it. And we think that's important. For all these reasons, I'm very happy to propose on behalf of Malaysia.
We thank the Honourable Member of Opposition for his speech. Without further ado, we call upon the Government Whip to conclude the case for the government benches.
Good afternoon, Your Honours, ladies and gentlemen. Here are some documents that also had sweeping progressive human rights embedded into them. The Stalin Constitution in the old USSR. The Constitution of the Republic of China under Mao Zedong. Yet I dare anyone on that side to say that these documents resulted in the creation of a human rights polity. Mere discussion and mere aspiration is manifestly inadequate, and it is incumbent on them to show that firstly, this declaration has teeth, or has the potential to have teeth for it to be enforced in the future, and second, that this declaration moves human rights discourse in a positive way in favor of the powerless, in favor of groups such as the ones in this room. I'm going to show you that in both cases, that is not true. To the first, will the ADHR have any sort of teeth at all? And closing opposition agrees that the only way this document can become effective in the long run is if it is enforced, is if there is binding power, is if a court has been created. And they say that ASEAN states will do this because they do not want to be seen as complicit. We, on the other hand, think that ASEAN states are perfectly fine with this because something else is more important to every single state. That for there to be a human rights court, for them to have to pay a political price every time there are human rights violations, they must give up something called sovereignty. And state sovereignty, despite all the evolutions in the ASEAN lexicon, is still fundamental to the identity of every single state. Because we are only 50 years away from colonialism, and state sovereignty is still seen as the main means through which national identity is expressed. Because the state in most of Asia sees the state and the construction of a government as the means towards the good life. Every single successful Asian state, like Japan, like South Korea, has had a very strong state. Likewise, the states in ASEAN, like Singapore and Malaysia, all believe in the primacy of the state. So whilst they might talk about human rights, when the rubber meets the road and it directly comes into opposition with state sovereignty, we posit that states will not give up that sovereignty. The examples are manifestly obvious. When you talk about ASEAN members of good standing, like for instance the Philippines and Thailand, when the Ampatuan massacre happened, as egregious a violation of human rights as you can see, there was no condemnation whatsoever from other member states because they know they have skeletons in their closets as well. Likewise, when the red shirts were massacred on the streets of Bangkok as well, only recently. In those cases, there certainly were killings, there certainly was torture, but absolutely nothing was done, and we don't see anything changing in the years ahead. The other thing they said here is that civil society will play its part to ensure that it is enforced, to ensure that ASEAN states are embarrassed. The problem here is that the ADHR and the AICHR that was created immediately before this effectively neutered the ability of civil societies to have an impact by limiting their role solely to the development of strategies. No human rights protection here, no enforcement, no means to investigate or embarrass the national governments that they interact with as well. If you need evidence, don't take it from me. After the declaration was signed, 64 civil rights groups, including I'm sure many groups in this room, came out and condemned that declaration as toothless and harmful. Other organizations like Amnesty International did the same. So even if you don't think NUS judgment here is sound, the judgment of all these civil rights groups who have been on the ground fighting for human rights must surely matter as well. So on the whole, they've never managed to show how now or into the future the ADHR will have teeth. Moving on to the second issue. How does the ADHR affect the lexicon of human rights? And they claim that it's important because the ADHR is ASEAN friendly, that the notion of Asian values is important to gain political buy-in. Now, we have nothing whatsoever against the importance of culture. We're Singaporeans after all, we came up with that term. But we think that the way this particular policy will move discussions about human rights will be particularly pernicious. They claim that because this is not Western, it will be more effective. Our point here is that this policy effectively reinforces the Western provenance of human rights through Article 6 and Article 7 because it places a false dichotomy between human rights and national and community identity and dooms them to forever be in opposition to each other. That is the fundamental problem. Nationalism is the single most powerful political force in the entirety of human history. It has caused 2 wars, millions of deaths, and is still the single animating force in most societies today. And as long as you entrench this dichotomy between nationalism and human rights, we don't think that human rights group will ever be seen as an in-group. If we look at the history of other states, like the United States, the reason why the American Constitution became important is because human rights was not seen as diverse and opposed to national identity, but part of national identity. When the Declaration of Human Rights is seen as central to their national identity, that is the only means through which discourse can be pushed in a meaningful direction of rights protection. That is why we disagree. We agree that there may be discourse. We just don't think that discourse will lead to anywhere good. Closing.
Malaysia and Thailand currently have an incentive to enforce the law because annually they are forced to consume and digest 30,000 refugees who are running away for their lives from the oppression which is happening in Myanmar. To the extent
that there has been progress in countries like Malaysia and Thailand, and dare I say Singapore, towards pluralism. The defining feature of all these movements towards human rights is that there has been no reference whatsoever to ASEAN or any sort of international institution. When the opposition and the government talk about democracy in Malaysia, they refer it purely in terms of vernacular nationalist terms. There's never been any reference to ASEAN as a means to protect human rights. All the human rights activists in Indonesia, for instance, or in the Philippines, avail not of the ASEAN Declaration or any international instrument, but of national ideals. The struggle for human rights is ongoing in ASEAN, and there has been progress. We don't deny that. We just don't think that the ASEAN Declaration helps in this particular struggle, and that is why this motion must stand. Lastly, they said this policy is useful because it creates case law and jurisprudential case law that will make sure that in the long run they will be followed. There is one fundamental flaw with that, which is that the ADHR is not legally binding, in that courts do not have to follow it when devising jurisprudence. That is why it is different to the Human Rights Act in the UK. And I would think as a law student, they would have been able to recognize that. But even if there is any form of jurisprudence, we think that culture here, because there is an ability to define culture, will mean that culture is likely to be defined by the powerful. And the courts are likely to side with the powerful. And that is precisely the problem. When you say that nationalism, for instance, is forever opposed to human rights, you also ensure that the powerful who gets to define what national culture is will forever hold a trump against the forces of human rights. And that is why the human rights will be affected in a bad way. Ladies and gentlemen, in an ideal world, there will be no need for a prop in this debate. In an ideal world, I would stand right beside opposition in saying that human rights is coming to ASEAN. We don't think this declaration is the means to do that, and that is why we regretfully propose.
We thank the Honourable Government Whip, and now to conclude the debate for today and for the opposition benches, we welcome the Honourable Opposition Whip.
Test. Being the only female in this debate, as usual, I would have to clean up the mess of the men. The problems that the men made, especially coming from side government. Everybody else is fine. The problem here, ladies and gentlemen, is as much as we want to talk about protecting the rights of individuals and protecting individuals who are defenseless, we should also take extra consideration in making sure that we do not just copy and paste rights that have been used somewhere else and implement it in your own country or even in your own region. Which is why even in this instance, because it's such a dire situation, because it's a situation and it's of an issue of such utmost importance that we should consider the domestic environment and the issues on the ground, especially considering that the issues on the ground are completely different compared to the issues pertaining to different regions, especially when talking about African regions and probably in the EU and in America. So we think that in this instance, we would say that especially coming from closing opposition, that the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights may be imperfect, but we're moving in the right direction and would lead to long-term benefits. A few points of contention or issues in this debate. Number one, let's just analyze really, are laws really always that perfect? Because the main contention coming from that side, even all the way down, was that apparently there's ambiguity in language. Ladies and gentlemen, nobody likes ambiguity in language. Even in constitutions, any declarations, even the declaration of within the EU region had ambiguities, but those things were solved. Why? It was because individuals realized that they cannot defend the defenseless, and that was the only way that they knew how to defend them, by arguing out these laws and arguing the validity of these laws and whether these laws were perfect. Because apparently, and according to them, I do not know where they stand. Because on one hand, it came out very strong, saying that we're not against any declaration. Any declaration is fine. But towards the end, you see them saying that the ASEAN Declaration was bad and we would like to adopt the UNDHR. But never showing to us that expediency will lead to efficacy. Because according to them as well, and especially said in the last speech, these things are not binding. If you would like to portray that these countries are as hostile as you say, because they can willingly kidnap people, torture them, and make them into slaves, how sure are you then are they going to also follow the new declarations and the new articles that you would like to create? Because they would still continue and would still behave in that manner since you portray them as hostile as you did. We don't think that's the situation coming from side closing opposition. What we would like to defend is the idea that legality, and especially when it comes to constitutions and declarations of human rights, it's always a process. The same way how the EU did it it the same way how Africa did it, where it started off with the commission, they made the declaration, and then they eventually had a court 5 years later, which were able to defend the individuals on the ground, which made it, now legally binding, and individuals were punishable for it. The same effect that we want to happen here. He quoted America, ladies and gentlemen. Apparently, it's the bastion of human rights. Yes, apparently that's the only way where black people will only be able to vote in 1963 when they had to retaliate. Women, ladies and gentlemen, were not able to vote as well because the only way they were able to vote is there was only pressure.
Point.
If you want to come up and tell us, ladies and gentlemen, that that's the bastion, that's the same thing that we're proposing. It's a process, right? These individuals have to come up. You can't just copy and paste and expect people to follow, because if you don't have the willingness of the states and the heads of government in this, ladies and gentlemen, then you will never make them follow any declaration that you would like to have under your proposal. Let's go on to the second issue, right, in today's debate, the behavior of these states. Because according to them, apparently now once they've changed, once we've reworded, everybody will be nice. No, that's not true, because if you want to portray them like that, they will never be nice. Coming from our side, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to continue the process, because pressure has always been existing and will exist. They give you examples which were backdated, especially when you're talking about this policy, this declaration, which was only implemented in less than half a year. We showed you there's also progress within these countries. Myanmar finally released Aung San Suu Kyi. The juntas were not as violent as they were before. Malaysia, in our own country, we had the ISA repeal, where there was a huge controversial issue of individuals being detained. Thailand, he gave an example of the red shirts. That was back in 2010, but they had their elections already, and Shinawatra is already back in power. So there's already change. Why did that change happen, ladies and gentlemen? It's because of pressure, and we think that kind of pressure will exist. If you look at Egypt, ladies and gentlemen, when the government was thrown down, there were also problems in the constitution. But because people were angry and there was pressure, the constitution was changed. Because apparently Morsi made himself more powerful than the judiciary, but that was torn down. We would like to have that change. How? Because concessions can be made, concessions that appeal to us. They completely ignored what the reality of the situation is. Is that initially, even Thailand, Indonesia did not even want to enter and don't even want to concede or give the consensus for the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. But they did, right? So if they want to say it's a political sacrifice, yes, that is the political sacrifice that we're willing to make. Because at least now we have an ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights. If we listen to them and we continued being stubborn, these three countries would have probably never joined in, and these three countries would have never probably gave a consensus at the end of the day. If you want to talk about sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, there's a huge incentive why sovereignty will be protected, because these countries also have their own self-interest to protect their own state from harm, protect their own state from refugees, because the cost of including these refugees is much too high. So it's always an incentive for these individuals to take into consideration. Before I move on, opening.
There's a clear solution gap in your model, because if your main propellant are judges that have no power to adjudicate, why is your main mechanism about having meetings every 2 years which are attended by the heads of state, not the judges?
Because the only way for you to actually have policies that work is to have critical mass. To have critical mass, to have discourse. The only way for you to have that is what Sadiq told you already in his speech. These case laws, these judges and these lawyers bringing it up in court and arguing and weeding out the ambiguity on its own, because they realize that they have to defend the defenseless at some point in time. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want, let's just analyze whether we can create a better declaration. Robin, gave an example. He mentioned USSR. There's a reason why we don't have USSR anymore, right? Because people realized it wasn't working, and people realized that it did not make any effect. Ladies and gentlemen, I might be an economic student. I do not know the legalities of things. I may not be so adaptive towards these things. But I know, as an individual, as an Asian, as a human being, as a woman, I realize that these things don't need to have, backdated knowledge or, professional knowledge, because these things are innate to me. If we continue to have this inaction, if you continue allowed to have these countries to regress because they don't feel that they are included, they feel that that's a Western imposition, then that inaction, ladies and gentlemen, the lives of these individuals, the blood of these individuals would still be on our hands, because we were still being stubborn and not being able to engage with any one of them. With that, we're very proud to oppose.
We thank the Honourable Opposition Whip for her speech. Ladies and gentlemen, this marks the end of our debate today, and invite you to give the speakers today a round of applause. At this point, we would like to invite the adjudication panel to retire. I pass the time back to Gayatri, our MC today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite you to join me in giving one more round of applause to our debaters. Our panel of adjudicators will take 30 minutes. They've requested for 30 minutes to deliberate. So we'll change our agenda a little bit. We have refreshments outside. Please talk to each other and connect, and we'll be back in 30 minutes for the results. Thank you.
Passport could be considered as a form of trafficking.